He wanted to split the budget to teach me discipline. He had no idea I was about to take everything. The cold, sterile light of our kitchen island gleamed off the screen of my husband Mark's laptop. He had it angled towards me, like a prosecutor presenting evidence. On the screen was a spreadsheet, meticulously color-coded, with columns for income, essential expenses, and discretionary spending. It looked like something out of a corporate finance meeting, not a discussion between a husband and wife of 10 years. "So, as you can see," he said, tapping a finger on the trackpad, his expensive watch catching the light, "my earnings have seen a significant uptick this quarter. It's time we rationalized our finances." He used words like rationalized and optimized a lot, ever since his tech startup started to, in his words, gain traction. I just nodded, wrapping my hands around a cold mug of tea I'd long forgotten. I watched his face, the smug satisfaction tightening the corners of his mouth. He thought he was being so responsible, so magnanimous. "We're splitting the budget," he announced, the finality in his tone making it clear this was not a negotiation. "I'll transfer your half of the mortgage and utilities to your account on the first of the month. Your car, your personal spending, groceries, that will come from your salary. It's the only fair way. It'll teach you financial discipline." He was looking at me, expecting a fight, maybe tears. He'd been chipping away at me for years, his comments disguised as helpful advice. Little digs about the cost of my hobbies, my frivolous purchases, the brand of coffee I bought. All while he wore designer suits and had just leased a brand new German sedan because it was important for his image. I felt a strange calm settle over me, a quiet clarity that cut through years of fog. I looked at the spreadsheet, at the column labeled Sarah's income. He'd put in the figure I'd given him from my part-time admin job. A laugh, cold and sharp, threatened to bubble up from my chest, but I swallowed it down. I kept my expression neutral, my gaze lowered. "Fine," I whispered. The word was so small, so defeated, but it felt like pulling the pin on a grenade. Relief washed over Mark's face. He'd won. He'd finally put his flighty, financially irresponsible wife in her place. He smiled, a tight, condescending little smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good," he said, closing the laptop with a decisive snap. "I knew you'd see reason. It's for the best, Sarah, for both of us." He leaned over and kissed my forehead, a perfunctory peck that felt more like a brand than a sign of affection. Then he went upstairs to bed, probably to dream of profit margins and synergy. I stayed in the kitchen for a long time, the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. He had no idea. He had no idea that his significant uptick was a drop in the ocean. He had no idea that the down payment for this house hadn't come from his seed funding, but from my signing bonus. He had no idea that when his startup nearly went bankrupt 2 years ago, it wasn't his brilliant pivot that saved it, but a quiet, anonymous wire transfer from an account he'd never heard of. He had no idea that my part-time admin job was a convenient fiction we'd both agreed to believe in, a story I'd spun to protect his fragile ego when my career skyrocketed past his. He had no idea that for the past 5 years, I hadn't been a part-time assistant. I was the senior vice president of a global logistics firm, and my little contribution was the only thing keeping his precious startup and his entire life from collapsing into a multi-million-dollar pile of debt. The budget wasn't just being split, it was being dismantled by me, and I was starting right now. I pulled out my own laptop from my bag, the sleek carbon fiber body a stark contrast to his clunky machine. I opened it, and the screen lit up my face in the dark kitchen. My fingers flew across the keyboard, first to my bank, then to my lawyer, then to an email I had been drafting in my head for years. His name was in the subject line. It read, Financial Rationalization. The next morning, the sun streamed into the kitchen as if nothing had changed. Mark was humming a jaunty, off-key tune as he poured coffee into his favorite mug, the one that said CEO in training. He'd bought it for himself. He took a sip, then looked at me over the rim, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a man who believes he has set his world perfectly in order. "See? This is better already," he said, gesturing around the kitchen as if the very air was now more financially sound. "Clear boundaries, accountability, it's the foundation of any successful enterprise." He was talking about our marriage like it was one of his quarterly reports. I just smiled faintly and slid a plate of toast in front of him. On the outside, I was the picture of compliance. On the inside, I was a general watching her battle plan unfold. Last night, after he'd gone to bed, my financial rationalization had begun in earnest. The email was just the opening salvo. The real work happened over 3 encrypted phone calls. The first was to Brenda, my lawyer, a shark in a Chanel suit who had been advising me to do this for years. When I told her the code phrase we'd agreed upon, "The canary has left the coal mine," she let out a low chuckle. "Initiating protocol," she'd said, the glee in her voice unmistakable. The second call was to David, my wealth manager. He managed the portfolio I'd built from stock options and bonuses, a portfolio Mark believed was a modest retirement fund from my old job before we got married. I gave him a series of precise instructions. Liquidate certain assets, move others into a newly formed trust in my name only, and most importantly, retract my personal guarantee on a 7-figure line of credit. The line of credit that Mark's company, Innovatex Solutions, relied on for its cash flow. The third call was the shortest. It was to my actual boss, the CEO of the logistics firm. "I'm taking a personal leave of absence," I said, "effective immediately." He didn't ask questions. When you generate the kind of revenue I did, you get a certain amount of leeway. Now, watching Mark spread jam on his toast, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath his feet was turning to quicksand, I felt a cold, exhilarating sense of power. He was lecturing me on the price of almond milk while the entire financial architecture of his life was being systematically dismantled. It didn't take long. Around 10:30 a.m., I heard his voice from his home office, a sharp, panicked bark. "What do you mean, under review? We have payroll on Friday." I was calmly pruning the rose bushes in the garden, a hobby he always called a waste of good money. The sound of his mounting hysteria was sweeter than the scent of the blossoms. A few minutes later, he burst out onto the patio, his phone clamped to his ear, his face a blotchy, angry red. "This is unacceptable. We have been a loyal customer for years." He paced back and forth, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up. He saw me watching him and made a frantic cut-it-out motion, as if the sound of my pruning shears was interfering with his corporate meltdown. He finally slammed the phone down on the patio table. "Unbelievable," he seethed, more to himself than to me. "The bank just froze our main line of credit. Froze it. Something about the guarantor's status changing. It makes no sense." He looked at me then, his eyes searching for sympathy. He expected me to rush over, to soothe his brow and tell him it would all be okay. It's millions, Sarah. The whole Q4 expansion plan is dead in the water without it." I carefully placed my shears in the terracotta pot next to me and wiped my hands on my gardening apron. I stood up and looked him directly in the eye, my calm a stark contrast to his frantic energy. "The bank didn't freeze it, Mark," I said. my voice even and clear. He frowned, confused. "What are you talking about? I was just on the phone with them. They said the guarantor pulled her support," I finished for him. He stared at me, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Her? What her?" "It's not a person, Sarah. It's a financial instrument. It's backed by company assets." His voice faltered as he tried to recall the details he'd clearly never bothered to learn. A small smile touched my lips. "No, Mark, it was backed by me." The silence that followed my statement was absolute. It stretched for a full 10 seconds, broken only by a bird chirping in the oak tree. Mark's face went through a rapid series of transformations. Confusion, disbelief, a flicker of dawning horror, and finally settling on a deep, wounded anger. His entire worldview was crumbling, and I was holding the sledgehammer. "You?" he finally sputtered, a harsh, incredulous laugh escaping his lips. "You backed my company? With what? Your pin money from that little office job?" The condescension was automatic, a reflex honed over years of casual dismissiveness. But this time, it had no effect. "That little office job, Mark," I said, taking a deliberate step towards him, "is as the Senior Vice President of Global Operations for Helios Logistics. My base salary alone is about 10 times what your startup has ever declared as profit. The signing bonus I got 5 years ago, that was the down payment on this house. The windfall from a distant relative that saved Innovatech from bankruptcy 2 years ago. That was me, wiring half of my annual bonus into your account while you slept, so you wouldn't have to face the humiliation of telling your investors you'd failed." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, puncturing his inflated ego. He was pale now, his jaw slack. He looked around the pristine patio at the expensive furniture, the landscaped garden, the gleaming glass of the French doors. He was seeing it all for the first time, not as the fruits of his own genius, but as things I had paid for. "Why?" he whispered, the fight draining out of him, leaving only a hollow confusion. "Why would you lie about all this?" "Because I loved you," I said, and the simple truth of it hung in the air, heavy and sad. "And you loved the idea of being the successful provider, the brilliant tech mogul. Your ego was so fragile, so wrapped up in being the man of the house, that telling you the truth would have shattered you. So I played a role. I let you believe I was just your slightly ditzy, financially irresponsible wife because it made you happy. It made you feel big. But I'm done playing." A car pulled into the driveway. Brenda, my lawyer, right on time. She got out, looking sharp and efficient, and gave me a curt nod. "What is this?" Mark asked, his voice trembling as he saw the briefcase in her hand. "This," I said, gesturing towards Brenda, "is the next step in our financial rationalization. We are splitting the budget, remember? Except we're splitting everything. The house, the cars, the assets. And since I can prove that virtually all of those assets were acquired with my funds, well, let's just say your half of the spreadsheet is going to look a lot smaller than you anticipated." He finally broke. All the posturing, the corporate jargon, the smug superiority, it all dissolved into raw, pathetic desperation. "Sarah, wait. We can talk about this. I didn't understand. I can change." But it was too late. He wasn't seeing me. He was seeing his credit line, his company, his comfortable life. The love, if it had ever been real, was buried under a decade of him looking down on me. I had held him up for so long, and all he'd ever done was complain about the view. "There's nothing to talk about, Mark," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "You wanted to teach me financial discipline. Consider this my final exam." Brenda handed me a pen. I signed the documents she'd prepared without hesitation. The house would be listed. The accounts were already separated. His company, without my backing, would likely fold within the month unless he could find another anonymous benefactor, which I highly doubted. I walked past him, towards the rental car that Brenda had arranged, which was parked discreetly down the street. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. In his quest to control my finances, he'd forced me to finally take full ownership of my life. He wanted to split the budget, and in the end, he got exactly what he asked for. He just had no idea that I was the one holding the knife, and I was taking my half, which, as it turned out, was almost everything. For the first time in 10 years, my personal balance sheet was completely in the black, and I felt free.